This afternoon, the Seapower and Projection Forces Subcommittee meets to hear testimony from the Department of Navy on the fiscal year 2021 budget. Before us today are Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisition, James Gertz, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Warfighting Requirements and Capabilities, Vice Admiral James W. Kilby, and Deputy Commandant for Combat Development and Integration, Lieutenant General Eric Smith. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. On February 10th, the Department of Defense presented to Congress a Navy budget that is at odds, many of us believe, with their own stated goals of achieving a 355-ship fleet. Instead of the 10 ships that we expected to see this year, we received a proposal, as the Congressional Research Service reported, for just 7, 2 of which are salvage ships or tugboats. Instead of 54 ships through 2025, we have a budget that cuts that number by 22% to 42 ships over the next 5 years. This budget represents the lowest number of combatants requested in nearly a decade. And to put this plan in context, it puts us at a shipbuilding rate and fleet size over the next 5 years below what was projected under the last administration, which was pursuing at the time a 308-ship goal. One of the most infuriating changes in this budget is cutting the Navy's program of record for production of 2 Virginia-class submarines per year to 1. This comes as combatant commanders have repeatedly warned of the looming reduction in attack submarine force levels that will see the fleet decline nearly 20% within this decade, beginning, ironically, in 2021, the same year the President's budget strikes a Virginia-class boat. Congress has strongly supported the 2-a-year build rate, and specifically the second 2021 attack submarine. Led by this subcommittee, the conference report for last year's NDAA stated the clear position that Congress expected the Navy to budget for 2 submarines in 2021. We authorized and funded a $200 million increase in advanced procurement to support procurement of this submarine. To date, we have provided at least $1.1 billion towards this boat. This baffling move was made even more confusing based on testimony that we've received so far in full committee. Last week, for example, HASC heard testimony from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs that it was not in the best military advice, it was not in his best military advice to pull an attack submarine out of the budget. The acting Secretary of the Navy explained that he was informed of the decision only after last-minute budget moves were made without Navy input. The Chief of Naval Operations indicated that his top unfunded priority is the restoration of funding for a second attack submarine. And the Secretary of Defense, despite submitting and defending a budget that cuts the submarine in 2021, stated that he personally believes that we need even more attack submarines than currently planned. On February 12th, Ranking Member Whitman and I wrote to the Secretary of Defense requesting the Navy's 30-year shipbuilding plan by February 27th. Our hope was that this plan would help our subcommittee make sense of the change in direction this budget represents for shipbuilding and the submarine fleet. I say request, but in reality, this plan is required by federal statute to be submitted with the budget. That requirement is clear. It does not say that the Secretary may present a 30-year plan at the time of his choosing. It says clearly that the Secretary shall. A few days ago, the Secretary wrote to Chairman Smith indicating his position that submission of the budget's 5-year planning projection is sufficient. Let me be clear. A 5-year plan is not sufficient according to the law. This subcommittee has produced shipbuilding marks as part of the NDAA year in and year out, relying on the 30-year requirement in order to make long-term investments, which is inherent to shipbuilding, unlike other Pentagon acquisition programs. So today, all Congress will see before we mark up the defense bill is a limited 5-year plan, a 5-year plan that, as a matter of plain fact, is verified by the CRS, puts us on a path to barely reach more than 300 ships within the next 5 years, let alone 355 or 390 anytime soon. As our witnesses and members of this panel know all too well, shipbuilding is a long game, with progress measured not just in years but in decades. Without a fuller understanding of what informs this request and where it goes from here, 2021 risks being a lost year in shipbuilding that will take years to recover from. So to our witnesses here with us today, I say we can and we must do better. Our panel has a hard-earned reputation for punching above its weight and producing tangible results for our Navy and Marine Corps. You can expect to see us do that again this year as we begin work on the 2021 Defense Authorization Mark for Seapower programs. And now it's my privilege and honor to yield to the ranking member, my good friend, Congressman Rob Whitman.
Well, thank you, Chairman Courtney. I want to thank you so much for your leadership and for your steadfast conviction to make sure we have the Navy that this nation needs. I really appreciate that, and want to thank our 3 witnesses for joining us today. Gentlemen, the administration has been consistent with their drive to expand the capacity of the United States Navy. President Trump foresaw the great power competition and called for a 355-ship Navy. Unfortunately, his vision and foresight have not been replicated in the budget request. This relentless drive on behalf of legacy curmudgeons to hold back implementation of the National Defense Strategy will continue to delay the required reform. It is apparent that we need to move toward a maritime strategy that will require both long-range strike and naval power. Yet the budget request continues to emphasize COIN operations and legacy force structure allocations. We have to do better. Of all of our nation's defense procurement programs, shipbuilding is by far the longest, most complex of any acquisition program. Shipbuilding requires years of planning, billions of dollars to capitalize the shipyards, and lengthy periods of ship construction. Yet, there are some in the administration who continue to believe that the industrial base is a faucet that can be shut off and shut on. Some believe that in the short term, we can add shipyards to expand our ship construction capacity. The reality is starkly different. I believe that this shipbuilding budget request is an attempt to begin to turn the faucet down. We are actually on the precipice of putting a number of shipyards out of business. And unfortunately, the administration's overestimation of the capacity and elasticity of the industrial base will have negative repercussions for a very long time. Central to these concerns is the budget request to order a single submarine. We are on an inextricable path to reduce our attack submarine force structure from 51 to 42 submarines. The combatant commanders are begging for more undersea strike capacity. Yet, this budget request seeks to perpetrate this egregious deficit. The administration compounds this shipbuilding deficit by an accelerated ship retirement schedule that includes 4 littoral combat ships, 4 cruisers, and 3 amphibious ships. Some of these ships have only been in commissioned service for 6 years or less. The math on these retirements, compounded by an anemic shipbuilding request, points us in the wrong direction. Gentlemen, I'm not a mathematician, but building 8, 6 of which are warships, retiring 11 doesn't get us to 355 by 2030, period. Can't get there. Furthermore, the administration continues to ignore the plight of our nation's sea lift. The Navy may point to the budget request to procure 2 used ships in fiscal year 2021. Unfortunately, the administration also endorsed a legislative proposal that would virtually eliminate any new ship construction effort for these sea lift vessels. General Franks, the then 7th Corps commander during Desert Storm, understood the value of these forces when he was quoted as simply saying, "Forget logistics, you lose." In sea lift, the only change from the last year is that our sea lift force has aged another year, can only accomplish 40% of the required tasking, and the administration is prepared to accelerate the decline of this essential logistics force. As to the Marine Corps, I'm actually delighted with the vision that the Commandant has placed before our nation. I continue to be impressed with this change and look forward to more actionable items to implement a long-needed turn to the future of military conflict. My hope is that the Marine Corps is timely in implementing these needed changes. Again, I appreciate the Chairman for his leadership in having this important hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Whitman. And now, Mr. Gertz, I think you'll be presenting a statement for the panel. Is that correct? Sir. Okay, the floor is yours.
Chairman Courtney, Ranking Member Whitman, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thanks for the opportunity to appear before you today to address the Department of the Navy's fiscal year 2021 budget request. Joining me today are Vice Admiral Jim Kilby, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Warfare Requirements and Capabilities, and Lieutenant General Eric Smith, Deputy Commandant for Combat Development and Integration. Sir, with your permission, I intend to provide a few brief remarks for the record.
Without objection.
We thank this subcommittee and all of Congress for your leadership and steadfast support of the Department of the Navy. Your efforts to fully fund the fiscal year 2020 budget for 12 ships helps provide the stability and predictability in funding that enable us to build and sustain the naval force the nation needs. And in so doing, execute the maritime component of the Naval Defense Strategy, or National Defense Strategy. Since the start of fiscal year 19, we've delivered 11 battleships to the fleet, including most recently the future USS Tripoli, our newest large-deck amphibious ship. Today, with the USS Tripoli delivered, we have 78 ships under construction or under contract and 46 under construction. We expect to take delivery of 12 ships in fiscal year 20 and award contracts for 8 additional ships this year. As we continue to modernize the fleet, we've also focused on ship and aviation maintenance, delivering higher aircraft mission capability rates, improved on-time deliveries of ships for maintenance, and reduced maintenance backlog for our nuclear-powered fleet. We achieved key milestones on the USS Gerald R. Ford, returning her to sea after a post-shakedown availability and qualifying all aircraft in her air wing and readying her for deployment, while launching the future USS John F. Kennedy ahead of schedule at a 16% reduction in labor hours from CVN 78. We're on track to begin full construction of Columbia in October 2020, with 80% detailed design complete at construction start, the highest level of completion at construction start in a modern shipbuilding era. Our use of agile and innovative contracting approaches have leveraged the many authorities Congress has provided, enabling us to deliver our ships, aircraft, and weapons with over $25 billion in savings to the taxpayer over traditional acquisition methods. Although our budget reflects the hard choices we had to make given a flat budget, our 21 request builds on these prior investments and improved acquisition outcomes in order to provide the best balanced force in support of the National Defense Strategy for the resources available. It continues key investments in advanced technology and modernization, prioritizing recapitalization of the ballistic submarine force. It supports the sustainment and readiness recovery to deliver credible forces today while pursuing increased lethality and modernization to ensure readiness for the future fight. It includes procurement of 44 battle force ships within the FIDEP and aims to continue a healthy industrial base that's critical in meeting this demand. And we appreciate the continued strong support Congress has always given us in preserving that industrial base through our shipbuilding programs. Thank you for the strong support of the subcommittee and for all that you've always provided our sailors, Marines, and their families. And thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. We look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gertz. And again, we've got a lot of members here who I'm sure are bursting with questions. So I'm going to kick it off, and I'm not going to belabor the point, but I do feel just it would be helpful on the question of the Virginia-class submarine program, just to get a couple sort of baseline bits of fact out, so which will help us as we move forward. So right now the Block 4 contract is underway in operation. The 2-a-year construction schedule teamed up between Virginia and New England. And then Block 5, which was just executed at the end of the year, again, contemplates a 2-a-year cadence, but by cutting a sub, we're going to reach a year where that's going to dip down to only 1 in terms of the construction schedule. Columbia, as you point out, begins construction late this year. The real ramp-up starts in about 2023. So the question I have is 2 questions. Number one, do you have confidence right now that the shipyards are capable and have the capacity to handle the 2-a-year build rate as required under Block 4 and at least the first 4 years out of the 5-year Block 5 contract?
Yes, sir. I had less confidence, candidly, 6 to 9 months ago, where we were seeing some of the Block 4 deliveries starting to move to the right. And the concern was, could we maintain the cadence we needed to and not add risk to Columbia? And I've said repeatedly before, the number one way to reduce risk to Columbia is a stable, well-performing Virginia program. And so at that time, we started working very closely with the shipbuilder to get that end of Block 3, start of Block 4 performance stabilized. I'm happy to report over the last 6 months that's stabilized. My concerns are not now, can they execute? They just need to continue to execute. At the time, we created a potential relief valve for that 10th ship in the multi-year. at this point and in the decision makings coming up to our budget release, it was more an affordability issue, not an execution issue. I'm confident they can execute the ship.
Well, I appreciate that, because I mean, it's almost like there's an intuitive sort of reaction that maybe, you know, the bandwidth is getting too clogged and it's too much. But the fact is, again, as you said, there's been some really good work done. The construction readiness review process, which I think has helped both yards get the modular units delivering on time. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, sir. If you recall, last year we also added a program executive officer for Columbia. And so the goal out of both sides was have a team focused on getting Columbia ready, getting the design ready, getting that ship ready to go, and then have a team dedicated to getting Virginia where it needed to be. It wasn't where it needed to be, you know, with high confidence. It is now, and so our intent is to build on that. We have the flexibility, given budget is included this year, to bring that ship back into the multi-year. As we were in the end game, it just frankly became an affordability issue with all the other constraints on the budget.
Okay, so again, we've sort of you know, confirmed that the 2-a-year build rate is you know, executable. I guess then the question is then if we lose that last sub in the Block 5 contract, which would be around 2023, which is at the same time ramp up is occurring. I mean, the fact is that it may add that sort of confluence of events may add risk to Columbia. Is that a correct way to view things?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think submarine construction is very sensitive to cadence. And the number one thing we can do is stability and get on a cadence. And, you know, as we went from 1 year to 2 a year and trying to hold that cadence, that is where we need to preserve it. Where it's also very sensitive to dips and workload. And so there is some work we're going to have to do at the end of 23 with the shipbuilder and understand and manage any potential dip in the workforce requirement, because the last thing in the world we want to do is be laying off folks right before we need to climb this giant Columbia wall. And so I think we'll have to watch that closely, work closely with you and the shipbuilder, with the committee here and the shipbuilder to manage our way through that piece. If we cut short and have a large gap at the end of Block 5 before having Block 6 move in and Columbia start up, that will be a risk to execution, not only in Virginia, but in Columbia.
So again, I think it's really important to sort of flesh that out. Today, you know, we've had probably 100 or so submarine suppliers sort of crisscrossing the Hill, and I talked to a number, as well as Mr. Whitman did this morning. This budget, frankly, has kind of sent a little bit of a shockwave in terms of just their own decisions about investing in capital, and you know, so it may be intuitive that this budget kind of lessens and makes it easier for execution, but in fact, it really actually creates disruption. The other point I just wanted to sort of quickly walk through with you is that if, let's say, this cut goes through next year or the year after, Congress wants to say, well, you know what, we actually probably should add a submarine later. The fact is the cost of doing that would be cheaper more expensive than what the cost of trying to restore this year's submarine. Is that an accurate analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. At some point, you don't have the capacity, again, back to cadence, to speed cadence up. This is the year I would say we need to either add that ship in this year, or then we'll just have to work on that at the start of Block 6. So we're very sensitive kind of to that cadence, and not. I don't think there is a way to execute 3 in a Columbia year with a high degree of success.
So with that awareness that it's really now or never if we're going to protect this build rate, I mean, I think that's very helpful. As the subcommittee moves forward in terms of trying to address this, and again, there's high interest on both sides of the aisle to do it. I just want to, again, as in the past, whether it was the Bush administration, the Obama administration, this subcommittee has been willing to work with the Navy and obviously all of your team to try and find a way to address, obviously, what I think is, people really are very concerned about. So with that, I'll now yield. Yield to Mr. Whitman, who.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to defer my time until later, and I'm going to go to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Whitman. Mr. Gertz.